Okie dokie. Hello. Welcome to this week's Tufts Capstone check-in for April 16th. I've only put a couple of things on the agenda. Um, One, I wanted to check in about we've got our mock grooming exercise scheduled for next Friday. I'm gonna write up an agenda for it, but I basically, I kind of want to referee or ringleader is maybe not quite the right term, but like I kind of want to try to do that for it, just to make sure that the engineers are giving you engineering and implementation based feedback, because I'm not sure how much they've seen of the design. And I think that it's quite common in early grooming for engineers to also give potential UX feedback. I think you're collecting that elsewhere, and what you're going to benefit from is more like their technical expertise. So I just want to make sure to like kind of guide them to the kind of feedback that we want. So I'm going to write up a thing for that. I'm looking forward to us doing that next week. And then also you shared your recent feedback result report with us. I didn't really have any comments. I didn't leave anything in there. I wasn't sure if you wanted to discuss it. And then I don't know if you have any other agenda items for us to go through today.
Yeah, we have an update from our side. So, we finished the first round of reports. I think we sent that in the Slack, and so right now we're currently working on reiterating our designs and also the script for our second round of testing. Um, I think we have two people booked for the second round already, and then we're also planning to reach out back to the people who um did the first round with us, and we had like a couple questions about like how we should go around like with our second round and also like our designs.
Cool. What do you got?
Yeah. So, at first we were debating to do like either an A/B testing or like an original versus the final prototype, but then we had like um a lot of like uncertainty from our results. So, from the remaining two people from our last round that we compared the sidebar pin feature versus like the main section pin feature. Um, they all voted the main section, but it like we couldn't go like 100% into the main section because there were different contents on like the sidebar and the main bar, and the main like reason why most people chose the main section was because of there was more information on that. Um, so we think that we might have to do continue with the sidebar as well and have it like consistent with the information to see exactly which location would be more beneficial.
Hmm.
Um, if you guys have anything else to add.
Yeah, like also during the interviews, something that popped up was maybe switching the position of where it is on the main section. So we're still like, so we currently have it all the way on top. Some people suggested after like the project description. And then we were also thinking maybe like near the activities section and the discussion thread. So yeah, we're just not sure where to place it just yet.
Hmm.
Yeah, to add on to the idea of like changing up the placement in the main section, I think we definitely had discussed this in previous meetings about having pushing our pinned feature at the very top kind of drowns out the description, which is still the main point that users go to get familiarized with the issue. So I think we definitely do want to like just to add on to how much we want to play around with the positioning of it. Another thing to add in terms of like still comparing side versus main is the fact that like a lot of people, or there was I think one participant that liked the side view of it because when they scrolled down to when it took them down to the discussion, they still had access to the rest of the pins, so they could like still navigate back and forth versus having to scroll all the way up for the main section pins. So like one of our general ideas that I think we did agree on was like kind of flip-flopping the attributes that they liked for each feature onto the other. So with the blocked section, um, trying to like implement some type of like kind of maybe like a pop-up of pins that appears when you're scrolling down if it's in the main section. And then vice versa for the side panel, somehow trying to include the more information that is in the main that people liked from the main section view, but somehow trying to incorporate it into the side panel. That way we can like kind of truly compare the two versions. But yeah, it's all very like conceptual.
Yeah, but then on the top of that, like in terms of the sidebar design, we talk about the truncation like in the previous meeting. So there's some like constraint specifically for that sidebar design. So I don't know like how I can like execute it like with more information when there are some like constraints, especially with how the sidebar is displayed. So that is like something that we are also considering.
Mhm.
And then not to like add on even to like all of these kind of different ideas that we were working with. Because I know I feel like just saying them out loud is kind of like tricky to keep them all in mind. But even another thing that we were playing around with or discussing was then what specific information to include when it comes to like the pin feature. Because like so we know for sure like people like having a quick view, a quick summary of the specific comment or discussion. But in terms of like what that quick summary looks like, I think another thing we talked about was like potentially including either like the kind of either like the whole discussion block kind of truncated up and like pinned up or just like keeping that highlight that we currently have.
You did also have a couple of participants who were surprised that the read more didn't expand it in line. Um, yeah,
Mhm.
a lot of stuff. I think that well, what's going through my mind is like, how do you resolve all of these choices in the time you have left? And I'm realizing that I don't have to answer that question. You do. Um, but how do you want to go about doing that?
I feel like off the top of my head right now, I'm thinking because one thing we also like we were discussing since we meet on Mondays and like we were having all these discussions was kind of the idea that all of our all the things that we're questioning and proposing, it's like because of specific things that our participants have said. And so I think like right now I'm like as long as we like with our choices, we know we can point back to okay, like because of these specific reasons. I'm kind of more on the idea of like, well, we're really just testing it right now and like it could be wrong. And I guess like going back to your whole or your guys' whole general idea, like even if it does end up being wrong, well, now we know which direction to go into. So I think like specifically for timeline reasons, I think for sure like we're just gonna have to make the choices and then as long as we know that they're valid for based on our specific like data points, um, that's how we can kind of like trust ourselves in the choices that we make.
Mhm.
Then another consideration that I think of is like putting all the things that we thought of in sort of like a prioritization matrix where we consider like between the user needs versus like the technical constraint and the time limit that we have. But to do that, I think like we need to also involve the engineers in the design process so that they can give like constructive feedback on what option to go forward with.
Mhm.
I think that would be a really good method to use to help prioritize.
taking a step back, so from apologies for joining late, my dog decided to play with other dog for a little longer than needed. So right now we're kind of stuck between these two ideas, right? So it's like you got mixed feedback on both, and the idea is let's mesh the two because it sounds like it'll be the most conducive, right? What if we, this is I want to lean into, this is your capstone, definitely make the final call and you'll need to kind of have a final product. But I would maybe have a confidence interval, as in like we are confident in these decisions, but we are less confident in these. I think that'll go a long way. I know that's actually one of the things that works in uh, corporate life better than actual academic life, because academics probably more very much like you do need to deliver something obviously to your capstone. But I would include confidence intervals, as in based on user feedback, we know that this is the right one and this is the right one based on kind of the user needs that we've identified, but we are less clear about these. From a product side, I would want to see that because I would want to know what kind of feedback should I expect or what kind of feedback should I press on if I have the opportunity to with customers. So it kind of provides me with the transparency of like, hey, I'm pretty confident on this and like the industry's going in this direction and it's not an anti-pattern, but it may not work for our users because of X, Y, and Z. I think being aware of all of that is really, really important and shows your comprehensive knowledge of what you've been working on. But at the end of the day, I don't want to kind of sway how you're graded on this as well. So if you need to have a deliverable, as in like, this is the actual solution, this is how we feel, like we can figure that out as well.
Emily, going back to what you said about, all of these things we're questioning and wondering if we should change or based on like specific things the participants said. Um, I would encourage the four of you to think about the bigger picture. Think about kind of the forest. You're running into some very interesting trees. Like the big question is like, does this pattern that we're thinking of solve the higher level question, right? And then I think the higher level question you're trying to solve is like, we want someone who's new to this issue, who is suddenly responsible for it, to be able to like get up to speed faster. And based on the interviews that I have watched from you and based on your like report outs, it looks like you're getting positive affirmation on that. It looks like you're tracking on solving that problem. I think that that you don't have enough participants, unfortunately, for it to be easy to kind of say, well, statistically this is relevant, because you've got like, four people all said the same thing. Well, is that 100% or is that just like four people? But I think that, yeah, a lot of this, I think a lot of these things can kind of go together. Like you have some confirmation that your higher level pattern seems to be working. You've got some considerations about different variations. I think it's probably valid if your final deliverable is like, this is the version of this we think will work the best, but here's a bunch of variations that we thought about, like kind of, again, like the appendix of like, boy, all these other things we would have done if we could have had time kind of thing. But I also do think that like it's a real thing that happens where you like don't really have enough data, but you do have to deliver something. So I think it's a good experience for you to kind of be grilled in this way. And no one's going to blame you for saying like, well, based on the data that we have, this seems like the best way forward. There is no final answer, basically.
One thing that we do at GitLab, which we don't have the best methods right now to do, but when we think about measuring success of the feature, like Chad said, sometimes we don't have the enough data in the beginning to validate that this is something that we want to ship, and sometimes we just need to ship the thing because we need to keep up with competitors, for example. We have to then get metrics or data on how that thing is going to perform. Does it actually solve the problem after we ship it? And we have different ways of doing that right now. We don't use third-party tracking tools in GitLab, so we can't like be able to measure, like if you we don't have a very easy way of looking at like where the user scrolls on the page or something like that, but we can track how often does the user use this feature, because we can put tracking into like a button or something like that. So one thing that you don't, I mean, you don't have to think about this, but for real life experience, it might be good to get some practice with thinking about what's the measurement of success and what could you recommend to the team who takes this on? Like, what could they measure to be able to really figure out if this solves the problem?
Yeah, I think that basically almost kind of gives you a bridge to saying like we don't have 100% answers to all the questions, but when like basically when this goes to production, it won't cause anybody to have a bad time, so it'll be safe to have in production. But here are the things we can track on it that will tell us how it could be adjusted to work even better. And I think that this is probably a good time in your project to start thinking about those metrics.
And I think we talked about experiment beta versus general availability last time, but think about that, right? So if we release it as an experiment, that's truly something that we're not sure about and we don't have a lot of support for. And by adding those metrics, you get to see how users are actually interacting with it or not interacting with it. And that can potentially drive you to a different solution, right? Or a different assumption. So if we look at it from here is the first iteration we want to release, here are the metrics that we want to measure, and based on those metrics, here's maybe our decision tree, as in we'll go with iteration, or we'll go with the second option if the signal is here, we'll go with the third option if the signal is this. So I do want you to also think about it's not just you go into production, it lives there forever. We do have steps, as in let's release it as an experiment, and only users who opt into experiment and beta features get to see those. You're not forcing them on anybody. So you kind of get a little bit of information there with a customer base rather than just user research.
Yeah, and I think it's also a good idea to say the reasoning why you think it's more effective to run this way. I think that would make your argument more stronger. And I was reviewing your research Figma file, so I just don't want to share my thought directly, but just by looking into like your research board, I think like seems like people like the pin feature for sure. Um, and I think like what Gina suggested is the maybe right approach to do. And maybe you can just review this Figma once again, because I think the previous conversation that you just had before was more focused on the location, like very specific about the design. But maybe you could also think of like the feature planning, like in the future iteration, how you would expect this feature would be used in the future from the real customers. I mean, just think about that. Just be creative, because you cannot test that right now, but you can just say like for the future plan, maybe you can scale this feature ABC. I'm pointing out this because we asked these two questions in the rating. Easy to find, like helpful for the workflow, like impact on efficiency. So that would also point to the discussion that like which problems are we solving and like how the solution can solve those problems again.
Does that help answer your question around how to progress, or is this more of like, this seems like a lot of caveats that we need to include?
No, I think that definitely helps. Yeah.
I need to say that most of it is caveats, but a lot of it is just like we're unsure this, but we are sure up to X percentage on this. So it's constantly iteration, which is, I know, a frustrating part sometimes.
And not to like metagame too much, but this moment in your project is a slide in your final presentation, right? Is like we were getting so close to the end, but then like, wow, all of these possibilities opened up, and like, what way do we go? How do we choose? Like finding a way to talk about this kind of moment of like indecision and what way do we go, and then talk about what you did about it is like probably also a powerful moment in your final project presentation. And also, I would like to point out that like planning for how you and your team are going to live with this thing once it is in the product is also like a very mature designer thing to do, you know, like not just like, oh, it's done, throw it over the wall anyway, never think about it again. Like it's a good thing to think about, like, okay, well, once this is out there, how do we know this actually worked? Like, how do we want to plan for like adjusting it or whatever? You know, if we had longer, if Tough worked on like a, you know, trimester system or something, and we had like some extra weeks, it would be interesting to do not only like a fake grooming, but also like a fake, like, you know, follow-up planning session, that kind of thing. We don't have time for that, but it would be interesting for you to think about some things you would want to bear in mind for that, you know.
And then for the grooming session, like how should we prepare to present to the engineers, like in terms of the design documentation and stuff?
I think probably what will work best is so you've got an issue already that you created. I think you can probably work off of the issue that you created, and it will work well, I think, if you walk through your final version, like the version that you want to group. So only do one of them for the grooming. Be like, this is it. Like for the intents and purposes of that exercise, we're saying like this has been verified. This is the thing that's getting built. I think walk through your prototype. You know, maybe walk through like the static you know, frames in the Figma file if you need to. And we're going to want them to ask questions to help clarify like you know, implementation. So your job is just to present them what the vision is, how the behavior should work. You might even want to try making kind of like a maybe a numbered or bulleted list of like acceptance criteria, basically from your perspective as designers. Like, you know, like when the user visits an issue that has pinned comments, they should see a pinned comments section. It should appear at this part of the page. It should contain this information for each pin. You know, clicking on this should do that, that sort of thing. Like kind of write up some light specs going into the conversation, because A, that will help you remember to make sure you bring those things up, and B, that can kind of be, you know, that acceptance criteria list can kind of be where the discussion gets to, you know, like they can look at it too and say, oh, you say this, how should that behave, or like what about this edge case, that kind of thing. In my experience, like QA engineers or just experienced engineers are very good at finding the like, oh, but like the user could get in this weird state with the data. Do you have, what are your thoughts on that, designer, that kind of thing? I envision that being how this goes, but like the main thing you want to do is make it clear what things you want to have in the UI and what behaviors you want them to do and what you want to allow the user to do to interact with them. And then kind of we'll go from there with what feedback the engineers have about it and kind of what their thoughts are on how this could be implemented, what the data structure would look like, all that sort of thing.
Sounds good.
So, and to add on that, to share my own experience, what like mostly like happened like during this type of meeting is, I think it would be helpful if you already think of like a couple of error state. For example, like someone started to painting something, but they failed because of whatever reason. But in that case, like how do you show the error message? Are you going to use, I don't know, like alert, or how do you communicate this error state with our users? So mostly like those questions should be answered in this meeting. So I think it's always great to have like some designs already have in mind before this meeting, because yeah, that I think that's the most frequent questions that I personally got in the grooming session.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It can be very easy to only think of like the happy path, but things will go wrong in production, so it's good to have those thought of in advance. I have been on both sides of this conversation previously in my career, but at GitLab, I have actually never been in one of these meetings just because of the particular nature of my work. So Sunjung and Gina, from a designer's perspective, and Dasha from a PM's perspective, I don't know if there's like other stuff about like kind of the way that they're going to experience with like GitLab engineers and their expectations coming into this kind of meeting. It's also fine if no, but I'm not sure if you have any like GitLab specific advice for the way that this one may go, because these are engineers who work at GitLab, so they're going to bring kind of whatever their expectations about the way we work to it.
I think from the product side, what my UX counterpart and I really focus on is what is the problem that we're solving and why now? I think product obviously helps with, hey, here's what we want to focus on, here's the direction, and then UX research and design will go into, okay, so we think this is space. The space is important, and here's our synthesis. But when you're going into, let's say, a grooming session, or you're presenting this to your engineers, I think just to make sure that you give them a TLDR a little bit so they don't have to parse through everything, but give them information up front. So in an async environment, people would prefer to have, hey, give me all the details and I'll come to the meeting prepared to have a discussion. But even in that meeting, really make sure you have, this is the problem we're focusing on. And I've had in the past where they're like, we don't think this is the best way to solve it. Are you sure? And be ready for that kind of feedback, and that's okay. But start with what is the user problem that we're solving and why are we addressing it now? Maybe like for this case, we can say, hey, we've had a lot of confusion, we've had a lot of team members start, and we've had this feedback. But set the scene. I think that'll be really important for the conversation moving forward, because I've seen when you jump into issue by issue by issue, you're not really understanding how are all the issues connected.
Yeah, you don't get a lot of practice at this kind of thing in school, but it is maybe the most important part of being a designer who works in a like functional pod or team, is like being able to sell why the work is important and why it should be solved the way that you've designed.
And I know I keep kind of, I'm a little broken record around this, but be really transparent with your unknowns. That's where you can lean on your team. I think to Chad's point, really important to kind of sell it, but also be collaborative, and the rest of your team can give you more insights, right? So at GitLab, like the wonderful thing is the fact that they're also your users. They will be using this product and they'll be able to tell you like, this actually, I started building this and this interaction is off. And I realize this is just a door to nowhere, whether it is an error state that we didn't account for, or more of like, ooh, this creates like 6 error states. And I don't know if we can actually tell the user what to do after this point, and that kind of invalidates a path. So I would say lean on your team, because they are your team, but also they're users at GitLab. And at other companies that I've worked for, engineers are very hands-on with the product, and it's kind of rare, I would say most organizations, depending on the organization, that your engineers wouldn't be interested in what is the final product and like where are we going with this, because that instructs them on how to build everything else in future iterations.
Yeah, I just want to plus one to Dasha about clearly communicating the problem and to provide some context around it. And then my other thing is you ran the validation, so you have data to back up your decisions. I would definitely rely on that. It's really hard to disagree on data that was collected. And then lastly, Dasha kind of she touched on this, but a lot of, we often have opinions about how we work at GitLab because we use issues. So like I think and we're just accustomed to sharing those opinions, but if you're able to prove that the solution that you're showing is coming from the data from external participants, I think that will really help make a case if, if they're offering like different solutions. That doesn't mean don't collaborate with them on it. I'm just saying like we should be making data informed decisions. So definitely use that to your advantage.
I wrote it down and then I guess I'll verbalize it is, what about doing a spike? Sometimes they're called charters. But yeah, what about doing a spike? And then you'll have a better understanding of technical feasibility, but also give you a chance to kind of address some unknowns. Is everybody familiar with like a spike? Okay, cool. This is where I get excited. I'm like, yeah, let me tell you about all the different ways we can schedule work. So think of a spike. Sometimes it's called a charter. Anybody else, feel free to drop all of the other synonyms we use for those in the industry. But think of this as kind of a way for investigation. It's not a committed piece of work, as in like you must deliver this. The deliverable is the information in itself. So whenever we start a big feature set, we do first a spike, which is me asking, is this technically feasible? Is there anything else that's missing from this? Like one big thing could be, hey, like this does not fit into our UX pattern at all. Like there's nothing in pajamas that supports this. We will need to do that in order to get started. So spike could be something really, really, it's an opportunity for you to ask all your questions and for engineers to answer all of them. Just how I think about it, as in like, give me all the things that you're concerned about, and then we'll talk about it. And that spike informs how we move forward. So for instance, if engineering says, hey, Dasha and Taylor, we can do like this box here, but after that, like you're gonna have to think of something different because like it won't actually float in the way that you want it to because of these constraints. And at that point, we can say, do we pivot or do we persevere? Right? Do we keep going and say, yep, I think we're going to solve this problem with just the minimal approach? Or like, ooh, this actually doesn't solve it. This just introduces more complexity and maybe user frustration. So we're just going to scrap it. So I really like using spikes just to have that information. And from engineers, I've heard that they really like them because it doesn't mean they have to commit to an implementation, but rather have an open discussion and understand the pieces before they get started. It's yeah, let me know if that kind of makes sense. I can probably dig up a few things around spikes and charters and how engineers think about them, like what's the best way. But at GitLab, I personally really use them with my team to convey the fact that this is a new thing. We don't have a blueprint for it. Nobody else at the company has worked on this. This is a new thing.
So,
How would you? Sorry, go ahead.
oh no, I was just gonna ask a clarifying question. So like in this, like in our scenario, we would like if this is like a real world we're working with like in a company, we have like our designs and stuff, so then we would create a spike to then as like an addition in presenting to the rest of the team.
I would start with what are the things you're confident about, right? So as in like so I guess a couple of prerequisite steps. You're going for a hybrid approach between the two. And you should have a finalized design of what you're thinking about, as in like, here is the user problem that we're trying to solve, and we believe that we can solve it this way. And a spike is more of like a technical implementation spike, as in like, can we actually do this? Are we missing any pieces? So as they work maybe towards a POC or a demo for you, you can see how it interacts. So one way to do it is just to say, hey, here are the requirements, go ahead and build it, and then give you all the unknowns and I would say blockers that could potentially do that. So it is working towards your iteration. It's not just throwaway work, but think of it as a risk mitigation so you don't have to commit it in case there's something iffy that comes up. So don't think of this as kind of like, oh, yay, we get to have an engineer who gets to work on this and we can like decide not to do it. You still have to come in with very, I'll say strong convictions, but good positive data to show that this is worth development effort because that's a very costly thing. But it can help you unwind and understand some of the unknowns from a technical feasibility standpoint. So maybe that's a correction on my end. For technical feasibility and implementation, a spike is perfectly fine to use if you're not sure if our system can support X, Y, and Z.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
Yeah, and let me know if that's not clarified. It's still early morning for me, and I tend to monologue in the morning, so feel free to interrupt me at any time.
No, I think that second one, that yeah, definitely like honing in on the for the implementation part of it. Yes, it did make sense.
Oh yeah, sorry, I missed that part. Yeah, it's for the implementation piece of it. This is as in a grooming session, like historically, right? If you think about a company that does ceremonies, like a grooming session is probably like an hour, 2 hours. I've had them for 3 hours sometimes, which are so painful. But you'd want to present things, you want to get through things. So a spike is also a good way of saying, hey, I know we're also having a lot of conversations around this, but here's a spike where we will understand and answer those questions on the engineering side. Maybe a tip for a backlog or a grooming session is you kind of have to stay on schedule. Otherwise, you won't get through a lot of things if you open everything up to a discussion.
So, Dasha, is your idea that instead of the students grooming this as though we're going to build this and implement it, they're grooming for a spike, basically?
Spike would be
Or-
part both. So it depends on kind of where your findings are at. If you're confident with, let's say, the MVC, and you think, hey, we have a hybrid approach, we have really good signals around this, we want to implement this, right? But we're unsure about everything else. That can be a piece of work that you and your product counterpart, like, we're happy to deliver. Let's go forward with that. A spike, I think, is also good there from a technical standpoint. But a part of that spike can also be, what are the paths that I'm not accounting for? So as they're developing it, what are the things that they're having a hard time with implementing? Maybe it's the actual floating piece. Maybe they're missing UI UX elements. This is solely an implementation, and it gives you a little bit of a buffer to have that conversation with engineering without having to be overly prescriptive with the user flows.
So just to clarify, in like the real world, the engineers would be actually like trying to implement it and then like contacting us with like the problems. But for this case, it would be kind of like hypothetically, if you were to implement it, like what are the problems you would face, kind of.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. Spikes have I'm kind of teetering here on the line of the things that is okay to ask from engineers, but I think a spike is a good way for you to de-risk it and not go full implementation. We also have the idea of POCs at GitLab that I leverage quite a bit. It's part of like experimentation and or innovation. So we can also think about doing a POC if you're not like a proof of concept. If your product counterpart and business is on the same side as in like this is a problem we're really wanting to solve. That's also a path that we can think through.
It's less clear to me what this looks like during the hour session we have scheduled next Friday.
I see. As in, you think a spike will just throw it off or close the conversation?
Well, I mean, my main goal in this is that I want the students to get the experience of having their work groomed and getting that technical feedback kind of at like and I think that like we're only asking Natalia and Dylan for an hour of their time. Like might send them some stuff in advance. They might be nice and read that in advance. But I don't know, like if we ask them in an hour to be like, okay, let's like pretend you're doing a spike about this, that may not fit in an hour.
Mm. See,
And I
how we
think it'll
come
be
in.
different feedback that the students get from that.
Okay. So I see your point. And yeah, an hour would definitely, you'll have to keep going. Are you thinking of just presenting the issues, or like what's the format that we'd like to, like what's the format that we're thinking?
I was envisioning basically like, okay, we, the imaginary team that is working on this, are like gonna build this, and it's the first time that these two engineers are actually seeing it. They're going to get presented, here's the flow, here's the screens, here's the behaviors that we want, here's the data that we'll need. And then kind of just like they're a little bit kind of riffing on the fly, like, okay, well, like I have this question about that from a technical perspective, or oh, actually, we have another pattern that could totally be used for that, and like I see that this, like oh, I think this would be like a very high weight. We'd have to break this down, or like this, that's I think the kind of feedback that I would hope that they would give is kind of getting a sense of like, oh, okay, when the rubber meets the road on this, like here's the stuff that an engineer has in mind. Here's kind of like their perspective on this kind of stuff. Because all the feedback that they're getting so far is like either us giving design feedback or process feedback, their participants giving design feedback. I think in kind of like an artificial situation where it's like, okay, let's say we've decided this is the thing that we're building.
Mhm.
How does that interaction with the engineers, with kind of that handoff and kind of integration with kind of starting to make imaginary real happen? That's what I was hoping to get them out of this. Now, I do think that framing it as we're going to do a spike or we're going to do a proof of concept, but it's still we're grooming for that, I think may actually be useful in kind of like, I don't know, like giving Natalia and Dylan a sense they've got kind of some more freedom of movement or more range with the kinds of feedback and questions they can bring up.
Let's go with Chad. I was like, scrap what I said, but Chad's on. Yeah, I completely agree. I think that reframed the scenario in my mind. I would say think of the spike as something that if you'd like to introduce, and also it's something that you can make towards the end of a grooming session. I've done that plenty of times, and it's pretty standard practice that I would introduce an idea, and then we would go through the happy and the sad paths, and then our engineers are like, this is something brand new. I understand the user problem, but like technically this is going to be a little bit of an unknown. And after those conversations, you're like, great, let's do a spike on it first. And then if all goes well, we have a list of issues that we can then tackle. With that, so think of a spike as maybe a result of the grooming session. And if there are unknowns, you put the spike as the first thing to work on. But the rest of your issues are valid and is more of like, yep, we found a technical path forward. Let's move on with the rest of the features work.
Mm-hmm.
Chad, is that more in line with what you're thinking? Oh, sorry, Sanjan.
Right. No, Chad, please go ahead.
I think so. I don't know if this is the way they're like supposed to get used, but in my experience, spikes are almost always created on the fly during a grooming session because someone realizes, wait a second, we need to learn more about this. And a spike basically ends up being a research issue that is assigned to an engineer, is usually what it means. It's like, go figure out something about this. Find a library that works for this. Find a data structure that works for this. Like, go do some skunk works and come back with information to the team that will help us guide our implementation. Again, I don't know that that's like the way they're supposed to happen, but I almost always I've seen them be a thing is like, oh, we need a spike. Hold on, sorry, you're gonna need to do this. Is the first thing you're doing this sprint is this spike, and then we'll work on the rest of it.
So I have added a couple of question template that I personally use at GitLab. So I always change, but this is my starting template because it really depends on the context. But normally I don't remove this third question about feasibility issue because of that. Because this normally comes out like, well, you know what, like engineers started to discuss about their implementation plan and they may decide like, well, actually, hey Dasha, we need a spike issue because of this reasoning. Or sometimes like, well, it's actually simple to implement this change because of A, B, C, D. And maybe they could just come up with the list of issues. So it really depends. So I think you can kind of already frame the questions before the meeting, and that's always what I prefer to do. But otherwise, the discussion can go quite wild, or it's also a little difficult to get the right scope of the feedback because they're also not designer. So I always like to just put the question first, but yeah, it's just the example and you can just create your own. for this meeting.
Yeah, and I do think that I want to kind of set expectations with them at the start to say, like, try to focus your feedback engineers on feasibility and implementation details. And the students are collecting UX feedback in other areas. So unless there's something where you're like, oh, because of the UX of this, it'll cause these cascading data issues or something, I would like to ask them to focus more on feasibility and implementation, only because this is your unique opportunity to get that feedback. You can get UX feedback in other places about these sites. Usually, I think you would totally get UX feedback, and often quite valuable UX feedback, during this kind of conversation with engineers, but just because we're limited on time, I want to try to get like the unique thing they can give you the most.
Going
Then
back to
I just like add more like detailed question about implementation and then just let them start from there. Otherwise, it might be sometimes it can be really like it goes in a weird way. So I would like put at least 3 questions so that like engineers can just think of it like before joining the meeting, and then you can just lead the conversation as you want.
And I
Sorry,
think,
Dasha.
oh, no, I interrupted. And I think part of that conversation is also thinking about sequencing. And probably one of the more important things coming out is what blocks what. As in, like, what do we need to do first? Because I think an assumption that a lot of us probably have is like, oh, we can just assign this to multiple engineers and then they can just work on this in parallel. And in a parallel universe, we can't parallelize the work. Bad jokes in the morning. But I think it's important to think about, all right, where do we start? And then they're like, oh, we'll have to do this before we can do this. And a lot of things obviously are a little more logical. Like you'll start with the actual, like, let's pretend we're building a box with components inside, right? You're going to start with the box first. But I think that'll be a crucial thing coming out of this grooming session is figuring out what do we work on first, and then what is dependent and blocking what.
If you also would like to put together some of these things, if you want to prepare it before the meeting, we can just provide you some feedback on that as well, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think we'll make like a rough kind of like guideline and also our designs by next week's meeting because I think we have our second round like all of next week, and then by maybe like a couple interviews we might probably know which direction we're going towards.
Cool. Anything? We've only got a couple minutes left in our time for today, but anything else we want to check in about, or anything before we hop off? Okay. Great. So yeah, put together, as you're like kind of narrowing in on like what your kind of final version is going to be for grooming, put together like a little guide, and then we can give you some feedback on that. On your like, boy, what version did we go with? I guess you'll see. Um, and we'll talk next week. We're getting down to it.
Yeah. I think sorry, I just want to say like definitely a lot of like helpful tips. I think on the whole like which version I did like the confidence interval idea and then the idea that Alan proposed too. So I definitely I do like feel confident moving forward.
One last thing is think about who would do what inside like the grooming session. I've had to solo it plenty of times where I'm listening and I'm also typing. And that is not a good uh, state to be in where you're trying to digest what engineering is telling you, or everybody else is voicing their concerns or even ideas, or as you're rewriting acceptance criteria on the fly. So maybe whether like somebody can just be in the comment and typing all of those things, I would kind of segregate that work if you can. That was my last thing.
Yeah, that's a really good suggestion. I would encourage you to lean into the roles that by the way, I don't know if you picked your roles within the team or if you were assigned them, but I would lean into the roles that you have within your team in this. So like Moya be a bit of a ringleader. The other three of you, I don't really know how it's split up. You're kind of just like all designers. I don't know if
Yeah, I think we ended up kind of like melting like to varying levels into honestly all four of us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have like roles, and then like for example, like An's like product designer, so she's like kind of like the head of the designing, and then we all help out, but like generally we all do everything.
Yeah, I don't know how important those roles are to like the project / your grade or whatever. You know what I mean? But like this meeting with these engineers is an opportunity to kind of like lean into like the flavor and character of each of those roles if you want to have some like specific stuff about doing that kind of work within the team to speak about in your final results.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Get out of here. We'll see you next week.
Hey, everybody.
Bye.